Tonight, we start with seat 17A on Aeroflot's flight this morning. Bound from Moscow to Havana, Cuba, that seat, 17A, was booked for Edward Snowden, the admitted NSA leaker, the man wanted by the United States government for violations of the Espionage Act. But as the doors of Aeroflot flight SU-150 closed and the plane took off, Edward Snowden was not on board. A bunch of reporters were on board. They all bought tickets when they heard Snowden would be on the flight, but he was not. And so all those reporters had a nice 12-hour flight to Havana on which there was no booze and no scoop. Right now, the most powerful government in the world is looking for Edward Snowden. And right now, no one can say for sure where he is. What we do know is that yesterday morning, just 2 days after the United States filed a criminal complaint for Edward Snowden, charging him with, among other things, violations of the Espionage Act, Edward Snowden got on a plane and left Hong Kong. Now, the United States had requested that Hong Kong arrest Snowden and hold him while courts processed an extradition request. The Hong Kong government's response was, well, possibly the most passive-aggressive official government text in the history of written communication. It reads almost like a Post-it note from your roommate left on your refrigerator. The Hong Kong government statement saying that because the U.S. had failed to provide the proper documentation, there is no legal basis to restrict Mr. Snowden from leaving Hong Kong. And in the most deliciously awkward part, quote, meanwhile, the HKSAR government has formally written to the U.S. government requesting clarification on earlier reports about the hacking of computer systems in Hong Kong by U.S. government agencies. Yikes. By the time that letter reached U.S. official hands, Edward Snowden had already fled to Russia, specifically to Moscow's airport, where a bevy of eager reporters gathered in order to greet him. There, Snowden reportedly met with the Ecuadorian ambassador. Ecuador, of course, the very same government that gave WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange asylum in its embassy in Britain, and whose foreign minister confirmed today has received an asylum request from one Edward Snowden. That request was reportedly facilitated by WikiLeaks, who now has a lawyer working with Snowden and whose founder, Julian Assange, has inserted himself into the story and spoke this morning to reporters on behalf of Snowden about Snowden's situation.
Both are healthy and safe, and they are in contact with their legal team. I cannot give further information as to their whereabouts.
Let's be clear here. We have no idea where Edward Snowden is. His U.S. passport has been revoked. He does not have a Russian visa. The Russian government is acting as if he is in Russia, and the U.S. government is acting as if he is there as well. We have no pictures or videos, only the eyewitness account of a man who says he saw Snowden on his flight from Hong Kong to Moscow. In other words, Edward Snowden has disappeared under the watchful, one might even say all-seeing eye of the United States government. The question now is what Russian authorities decide to do with him under the intense pressure of U.S. government officials.
We hope that the Russian government will look at all available options to return Mr. Snowden back to the U.S. to face justice for the crimes with which he is charged.
We are working with them or discussing with them, or rather expecting them to look at the options available to them to expel Mr. Snowden back to the United States to face justice for the crimes with which he is charged.
We have returned 7 criminals that they requested for extradition from the United States over the last 2 years. So we really hope that the right choice will be made here.
We're following all the appropriate legal channels and working with various other countries to make sure that rule of law is observed.
One of the most wanted men in the world, Edward Snowden, and we do not know where he is. But what he does next, and the reason this is all so dramatic and riveting, aside from just the basic facts of the story, is that what he does next is going to have a pretty big impact, possibly a massive, overwhelming impact on how his revelations play out politically here at home. Joining me now live from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, is Glenn Greenwald, columnist on civil liberties, U.S. national security issues for The Guardian newspaper. Glenn, of course, broke the Edward Snowden story in The Guardian. Glenn, my first question to you is, as Mr. Snowden travels around the globe and his whereabouts are unknown, are you in contact with him still?
I haven't been in contact with him since shortly before he left Hong Kong. So, no, I have not spoken with him. he boarded the flight in Hong Kong.
There was an article in the South China Morning Post today in which they replayed or they reprinted part of an interview with Edward Snowden in which he basically tells them that he had taken the job, his final job with Booz Allen Hamilton as a contractor at that facility in Hawaii with the explicit intention of essentially getting documents to then make public. I wonder what your reaction is to that and how much you think his motivations in doing this should be amongst the points of discussion we're having as we watch this story unfold.
I would think that far and away the most significant point of the entire episode, where most of our focus ought to be, if not virtually all of it, is on what we have learned the United States government is doing in complete secrecy in constructing this massive spying apparatus that a secret federal court in 2011 said was both illegal and unconstitutional, and that top-level Obama officials, including James Clapper, went to Congress and lied about when explicitly asked whether it was being directed at millions of Americans. That's where the overwhelming bulk of our focus would be. As far as the specific revelation today in that newspaper that you referenced, it isn't surprising to me at all. When I interviewed Mr. Snowden, he had said that he has worked at the NSA since 2009. Prior to that, he worked at the CIA for 2.5 years, that he gradually came to see that there was a lot of wrongdoing taking place that the American people weren't aware of, and had decided rather long ago that he would take this course of action to inform his fellow citizens. And I think what he said in the interview today was essentially there was one last set of documents thought he needed access to complete the picture, to be able to present a clear and full picture to the American public about what the NSA was doing, and for that reason went and got that last job through Booz Allen at the NSA facility in Hawaii.
Glenn, here's my question to you. As someone who basically thinks the things that we have learned about the government through Mr. Snowden's leaks have been vital, I am happy to know them. I much rather know them than not know them. I think there's some secret legal reasoning which has been revealed in the wake of it that has been an absolute and genuine improvement to our democratic conversation about our status and our self-governance. I am worried, frankly. I'm just going to tell you what I'm worried about. I am worried that if he shows up on the balcony of Raul Castro at some point in the next week, it will be as if everyone who has been championing the revelations has walked out onto a limb that they are now standing on him with, that is then going to be sawed off behind them, because now Mr. Snowden, the whistleblower, is in the hands of someone like, say, Castro or someone else who people generally do not view as a beacon of openness. Do you worry about that? Do you recognize the political consequences and stakes in where he actually ends up?
And, let me say, I don't think anyone thinks that Cuba is his intended ultimate destination. I think much more likely is Ecuador, which, for all its very significant problems in its political system, does have a democracy, does elect its president, who is widely popular among especially the majority of the nation, who are poor people. But let me just say two things about that, Chris. One is, it doesn't matter what you think of Edward Snowden as an individual. I happen to think that what he did was quite noble and heroic and courageous. People think quite reasonably that he should have chosen a different path. Wherever you come out on that, and whether he ends up in the hands of Castro or whomever, it doesn't really make a difference in terms of what you think about what we're learning about the U.S. government. I think it's critically important that those two things remain distinct. Yeah. The other issue that I think is vital is that we should ask, why does Mr. Snowden feel a need to go and flee and run around the globe going to countries that he probably doesn't want to live in? And the answer is because we've allowed our government to persecute whistleblowers. Read the column by David Carr in the New York Times today, where he says that the war on the press that the U.S. government is waging is not a matter of hyperbole, but math. Whistleblowers have no chance in this country because of this persecution, and that's the reason that he's fleeing, and that seems to me more important as well.
Glenn Greenwald from The Guardian newspaper. Thank you so much, Glenn. Appreciate it. Joining me now is Goldie Taylor, contributor at MSNBC and to thegrio.com. Goldie, I want to talk to you because I've been watching all this unfold, and I think the point I made to Glenn is basically where I stand on this, which is that I think this country is absolutely created this massive metastasizing secret government in the wake of 9/11. Classification has gotten completely out of control. There are all kinds of things our government are doing that they are not telling us about that we should know, and some of which we have learned from these leaks. At the same time, as I watch the personal personal drama of Edward Snowden unfold with a mix of fascination and trepidation, I do feel conflicted about, an American citizen who's possibly giving things to foreign agents, although there is no proof or reporting to indicate that has definitively happened. And I just wondered, as you watch this unfold, do you feel that way? Like, how are you processing this?
I think that there are a lot of us from the left and from the right and from all points in between who are frankly concerned about the Patriot Act or frankly concerned about NSA and what broad sweeping powers it may or may not have. I think that there are genuine concerns about that, and that this has opened a global conversation about secrecy and surveillance around the world. At the same time, this story has been hugely problematic from the beginning. The initial reporting around this has been sloppy at best. I think what we deserve are the facts laid on the table so that everyone can decide for themselves what they expect or should expect from their government.
So I agree about the facts being laid on the table, but part of the problem here, I mean, we're talking about the initial reporting that came out of the PRISM program, for example, and what exactly it is and how exactly it works. I mean, the issue that we're facing in all this, and I come on television every night to talk about this, is when we're talking about the Trayvon Martin trial, George Zimmerman trial, which we'll be talking about later, that was all open in court. We saw every word that was said. When we're talking about the decision that the Supreme Court issued today, we got to read the decisions. We talk about the Affordable Care Act, we can read the Congressional Budget Office. And in this, it's like we're all waiting around in this dark room, drawing these conclusions with these little shafts of light that illuminate this or that thing. And it seems so deeply toxic to me to having an actual self-governing republic that is the basic conditions under which we are operating.
Unfortunately, part of having a self-governing republic in this day and age means that there are going to be some points of secrecy that, help us to manage our resources and assets around the globe, that help us manage an entire intelligence community, which help us to manage an entire foreign affairs policy, and those kinds of things, should be kept secret. And but I agree with you. There are limits on those things. But when we're reporting about it, when we are advocacy journalists, and I do believe there is such a thing, then we have the duty to get the story right, to make sure that we check our facts against people who understand the technology that's being discussed, that people who understand, these PowerPoints that are coming out that talk about exactly what the PRISM program is and what it isn't, that talk about what direct access is and what direct access is or isn't. And so when we put stories out like that, large stories, national stories, global stories, then we ought to expect questions to ourselves, and we ought to be able to stand ready to answer those questions. Unfortunately, this first story looked like it came out, by Lilo and Stitch.
Well, but here's the thing on the first issue, right? What we are seeing now is if you begin to unpack this, or you begin to reveal, okay, there's some of this program is being called into light. And I think this isn't true of the court orders of the mass collection of phone calls. That I think we're pretty square on what that is and how that works.
We are.
Is that when you go to folks and for confirmation, right, of course, that still is all classified. In fact, it's against the same laws that Edward Snowden is accused of breaking for anyone inside NSA to say, actually, well, this is how PRISM works. And yet that's precisely what we want, because we want, I think, as adult citizens, to know what our government is doing within the bounds of reasonableness that does not completely expose sources and methods.
I think therein lies our issue. What is the boundary of reasonableness, and who gets to set that?
That's right.
Is it Glenn Greenwald? Is it Edward Snowden?
Or is it the United States government? I mean,
or is it the people that we elect to make those decisions for us? We ought to be making some of these decisions in the ballot box. Frankly, anybody who voted for the Patriot Act, we ought to be looking at them reevaluating and reaffirming this thing over and over again. And so I think we do have some power, and it's incumbent upon us to take that power. But do I trust Glenn Greenwald with that story? Do I trust an Edward Snowden to make that assessment? I'm not sure that I do, knowing what I know and what I've seen and how this story has played itself out.
I will say this. I trust them to the extent that I trust knowing things rather than not knowing them. And so I agree. There is no definitive word said about what exactly these programs are and how they operate, but I'm happy to know more now than I did a few weeks ago. MSNBC contributor Goldie Taylor, thank you so much.
Thank you.